Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about the relationship between Gardnerian and Alexandrian Wicca and the perceived differences between the two. Before I start this video, it's probably important for me to put out a great big caveat, which is that I am not an Alexandrian. I have friends who are Alexandrians. I talk a lot about the craft with both Alexandrian and Gardnerian initiates. I have been in circles with Alexandrians, but I have never belonged to an Alexandrian coven. I have only ever belonged to a Gardnerian coven, so my perspective is going to be just somewhat limited because of that. So take the things that I have to say here with a grain of salt and go talk to Alexandrians as well and get their perspectives on things. The reason that I'm making this video is that I think it's a question that a lot of seekers have, and probably especially seekers in the United States, for reasons that we'll get into. You know, when I was seeking, I was looking for training in a particular kind of traditional Wicca, and I was fortunate in that there were multiple covens in and around New York, so I had the opportunity to speak with multiple covens and really see who I connected with. But I was unsure of whether I should be speaking to Alexandrian covens as well as Gardnerian ones. I didn't really have a sense of what the relationship was between those two traditions, how similar or how dissimilar they were, and whether an Alexandrian coven might even be doing the kind of thing that I was looking for. So let's talk about it. My honest answer, just right up front, my honest answer is that there is no consistent and reliable difference between the Gardnerian and Alexandrian traditions. In essence, is sort of, if you go to the heart of what those traditions are, they're doing effectively the same thing, right? They are both initiatory traditions of witchcraft, focusing on the priesthood of a goddess and a god, the celebration of the Wheel of the Year, the mysteries of life and death, and so on. Like, they're doing the same thing. And really and truly, the only concrete difference that you can point to between Gardnerian and Alexandrian Wicca is that Alexandrians trace lineage through Alexanders, and Gardnerians do not. The best evidence that we have currently indicates that Alexanders did receive his first initiations from a Gardnerian initiate. There's some info about that in Ronald Hutton's book, The Triumph of the Moon. So, like, the two traditions are so similar, and in my mind, they're doing the same thing. If you're on the outside, if you're a seeker, and you're looking for a particular kind of initiatory Wicca, uh, whether a coven is Gardnerian or Alexandrian says nothing about whether it's going to meet your needs more or less. That is like just kind of an accident of lineage. And saying, oh, I prefer an Alexandrian coven over a Gardnerian coven, or the other way around, is as silly to me as saying, oh, well, I only want to be initiated into a Sheffield line Gardnerian coven. Because lineage is the story of how the craft came to you. It's a family tree. It is important in some respects, but it is also not something that determines the nature of your practice. You will often hear people say that there is more difference between individual covens than there is concretely between, you know, the Gardnerian and Alexandrian traditions. And I think, broadly speaking, that's true, right? Within each tradition, there are lines where you have, you know, dominant ways of doing certain kinds of things. So you might find consistencies within a certain line, but that's line-based, that's not tradition-based. And I do think it's the case. There's so much variation between covens, even within one tradition, that the thing that determines how practice changes is the coven and not the tradition. There's, I mean, I can think of Alexandrians whose practice more closely resembles mine than a number of Gardnerians, right? And then vice versa. I can think of Gardnerians whose practice more closely resembles mine than a number of Alexandrians I know. It just depends. It just depends on the people and the coven that you're in and what that coven wants to do. Now, all of that said, there is a stereotype, and the stereotype probably exists for a reason. We'll talk about the stereotype. There's probably a grain of truth in it, but also don't take that stereotype too seriously, because it is a stereotype and reality is more complicated than that. The stereotype is that Alexandrian Wicca is more high church ceremonial magic, and Gardnerian Wicca is more earthy, crunchy, hippie, sort of, earth-centered. And this stereotype is born out, just bumped the microphone, hopefully that wasn't too loud. This stereotype is born out in a number of ways. One is that the stereotype is that Alexandrians are more likely to do ceremonial magic. So the idea is that in an Alexandrian coven, you might be more likely to do Kabbalah or planetary magic or the fucking Abramelin ritual, whereas in a Gardnerian coven, the idea is that you would be less likely to encounter those things. Yes and no. I don't think that that's really true, because I know Alexandrians who have no interest in Kabbalah, and I know Gardnerians who are, doing the Trithemian conjuration and summoning Olympic spirits with their covens. It depends. It depends on the specific people in the specific group. But, the stereotype is there. It's also, I can think of 3 other main ways that people talk about the stereotype. One is that people will sometimes say that you feel Alexandrian Wicca up here. If you're in an Alexandrian ritual, you feel kind of the current of power up in your head, whereas people say that you feel Gardnerian Wicca in your gut. Do with that what you will. Again, there might be an element of truth to that, but I do think it depends much more on the coven that you're involved in, and is not a matter of the lineage determines how the power is going to flow. I think it depends on the interests of the people in the coven and the way that the people in the coven move magical power. Alexandrians also supposedly use a lot of incense. Alexandrians are stereotypically quite fond of incense. It is often said that if you can see the altar, there is not enough incense in the room. I don't know. I've also heard that said by Gardnerians. I personally don't go overboard with the incense just because I don't really want to fuck around and find out how sensitive my smoke alarm is. But that's the stereotype. And the final main stereotype that you encounter with the difference between Gardnerian and Alexandrian Wicca is that Alexandrians like things to be shiny. So where a Gardnerian coven might use a wooden pair of candlesticks, Alexandrians supposedly are more liable to use fancy brass candlesticks and to polish them before every ritual. Stereotypes are dumb, but, get out the brasso if you're an Alexandrian, and make the most of it. Yeah, I mean, so those are the supposed differences, really, between the two traditions, is that there is a feeling of kind of high church versus low church, ceremonial versus kind of down in the dirt, that people will sometimes talk about as a distinguishing factor between the two traditions. That's a vibe. And even if we accept that that vibe kind of broadly, generally covers the two traditions, which I'm not convinced that it does, there's still so much about the logistics of ritual, about the way that kind of the heart of ritual is done, that is the same between the two, that I think, again, if you're a seeker, if you're on the outside looking in and trying to find a coven that will fit your interests, don't rely on that stereotype as an assumption to sort of choose or disregard covens to reach out to. If you have an interest in ceremonial magic, assume that you can't reach out to a Gardnerian coven. And conversely, if you're not interested in ceremonial magic, don't assume that the Alexandrians are going to be doing things that you're not interested in. Go talk to them and find out who you click with. As far as the relationship between the two traditions, it is different in the United States than it is in Europe and the UK. And part of that is kind of an accident of history. So the Gardnerian and Alexandrian traditions come to the US at different times and in different places. They kind of develop their own cultures. Whereas in the UK, Alexander's was around and interacting with all of the Gardnerians from the time that he started doing his witchcraft thing, right? They were all writing bitchy letters to each other about him. Everyone knew everyone. It was a small community. And, there was a period of time where people didn't really trust him, people didn't like him, they thought he was kind of an attention whore with the media. But ultimately, the two traditions really came together. And nowadays, in the UK, and really in most of the world outside of the United States, the Gardnerian and Alexandrian traditions are treated as just being of the Wicca, just being initiatory Wicca. And they are different lineages, but they're understood to be different lineages that are more or less doing the same thing. Gardnerians and Alexandrians do ritual with each other quite freely. You will have covens where some of the members of the coven are Gardnerian and some are Alexandrian, and it's just not seen as a big deal. Everyone kind of perceives it as all under the umbrella of the same thing. And, there might be differences in how a coven or a particular lineage practices, but those differences are treated on the same level as the differences between covens or between lineages within a tradition, right? It's not like, oh, well, they're Alexandrians, so they're so different from us. In the United States, the culture of the two traditions really is quite separate. And again, this is partly an accident of history. The traditions arrive at different times and in different places. They build up cultures on their own. And then also, particularly in the 70s, but then going on longer than that, there were a lot of Gardnerians in the US who were really shitty to the Alexandrians, and who kind of had this attitude of, well, their lineage is fake, Alexander's, stole the Book of Shadows, or this, that, and the third. They're not real witches, and so we're not going to associate with them. That was certainly an attitude among some Gardnerians in the US in the 1970s, and to be honest, there are still some Gardnerians in the US today who have an attitude like that. So the culture of Gardnerian Wicca in the US, without generalizing too much, because there's always going to be heterogeneity, but a lot of the dominant culture of Gardnerian Wicca in the US was pretty hostile to Alexandrians, was pretty standoffish and dismissive. And, as a result, the two did not kind of form this umbrella, cohesive feeling of, we are of the Wicca, we're doing the same kind of thing in different ways, that you might find in the UK. Hi, sweetie. And I swear, one day I'm going to go to the UK and I'm going to teach a workshop called Why Are the Americans Like That? And I'm just going to walk through all of the historical idiosyncrasies that have made the culture of Wicca in the US what it is today. And it's going to be like, okay, here's what changed in 1969. And then these people got divorced, and that caused big problems in 1974. And oh boy, we can't even get into 91 until we talk about the catastrophically bad decisions that a bunch of people made in 1985. But because of the history of the two traditions coming to the US at different times, and a certain kind of dismissiveness and hostility toward Alexandrians from some Gardnerians, which does continue among some Gardnerians to this day, the two traditions have really developed separate cultures. And, there are also, there are people now who are really working to bridge that divide and build a more cohesive community of initiatory Wicca in the United States. There are people who are working to kind of cross-pollinate and bring those communities together. But there are a lot of people, especially like people on the Alexandrian side, who are kind of like, no, fuck you people. You've been assholes to us for the past 40 years. Why would we want to hang out with you? And honestly, I get it. But I do think it's a bit of a shame because I like the cohesion of the Wiccan community in the UK. I think it's much healthier. But change in culture takes a long time. And especially when there are old, deep wounds present, it's slow going. In the UK, again, Gardnerians and Alexandrians circle together without it really being a problem. And you will have covens with mixed lineages. You will have individuals who have both Gardnerian and Alexandrian lineage, who can then pass that lineage on to their initiates. In the United States, because the culture of the two traditions is much more separate, there are people who have both Gardnerian and Alexandrian lineage, but it's much more common for people to belong to separate covens and get those initiations separately. So if I, as a Gardnerian, wanted to, belong to an Alexandrian coven in the US, the expectation would be that I would kind of start over from square one, that I would seek out a coven, that I would go through a period of pre-initiatory training with them, and then that I would go through and I would receive all 3 degrees as an Alexandrian. And for people who have both Gardnerian and Alexandrian initiations, oftentimes they will practice those 2 things separately. They will either move from one to the other, or they will concurrently belong to 2 separate covens, one of which is Gardnerian, one of which is Alexandrian. And if someone has both lineages and they initiate someone, it's sort of understood that they're initiating someone into one of those traditions, depending on the coven that they're practicing in. So the culture in the US is, if I were both a Gardnerian and an Alexandrian, and the Gardnerian coven that I belonged to, I initiated someone into that coven, they would be treated as having only Gardnerian lineage. They would not be treated as having Alexandrian lineage as well. It gets complicated, but as opposed to in much of Europe and the UK, where there are lots of dual lineaged covens, where you just kind of pass both lineages on, and it's understood that those 2 things came together. So the cultures are different between the US and the UK. But the thing that I would like to come back to at the end of this video, because really, again, the purpose of this video is to help seekers try to understand the landscape of things and who they maybe should or shouldn't be talking to. Don't make decisions based on whether a coven is Gardnerian or Alexandrian. If there's a coven nearby you that has valid lineage in an initiatory tradition like Gardnerian or Alexandrian Wicca, reach out to them, talk to them, see if they're your kind of people, and go from there. Because between these 2 traditions, between Gardnerian and Alexandrian Wicca, there are so many similarities. And while there can be differences, those differences are not dictated by the tradition. They're dictated by the coven and by the culture of the people that you're encountering. That's much more what matters. And as for lineage, there are some people as seekers who want to seek out Gardnerian Wicca because they think it's somehow more legitimate because it's the OG, which that's not what makes your practice legitimate. But even if you're chasing that kind of thing, good luck to you. Remember, again, our best evidence suggests that Alexander's was initiated by a Gardnerian. It's kind of all the same. And I don't mean to be dismissive of, I don't mean to treat Alexandrian Wicca like it's just, a subline of Gardnerian Wicca and it's not allowed to be its own thing. It's not at all my intention. Again, especially here in the US, where the culture very much is that it's a community on its own, that it's a separate tradition. My point is just that as far as practice and legitimacy go, they're kind of interchangeable. You're going to get the same heart of Wicca with both traditions. You're going to get what lineage has to offer even though what lineage has to offer really isn't what a lot of people often think of it as. And the rest of it just depends on the group. So I think that is all I have for you today. So I'm going to wrap this up here. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you sometime soon. Bye.